The wind in Wyoming territory never truly slept. It was a living thing, a restless spirit that scoured the plains, peeling paint from the clapboard buildings of Laramie and driving dust into the lungs of anyone foolish enough to draw a deep breath. For Clara Harland, the wind was a constant reminder of her own desolation. It moaned around the corners of her small rented room above the mercantile, a lonesome sound that echoed the hollow space in her chest. 2 winters had passed since Jacob died, but the town's memory was longer and far less forgiving than the seasons. Clara was the widow Harland, not just a widow, but the widow, the one whose husband had met his end in a haze of cheap whiskey and bad cards, with a bullet from a faro dealer's pistol. Jacob had gambled away the last of their savings, the very ground beneath their modest home, before gambling away his life. In the quiet, judgmental parlors of Laramie, the women whispered that Clara had driven him to it, her quiet nature. They said her failure to produce a child, her inability to keep a man satisfied. They saw the polite, strained smile she had worn for years and called it coldness. They did not see the nights she had spent waiting for the stumble of his boots on the porch, her body tense with the knowledge of the rage or the cloying apologies that would follow. They did not know the loneliness that could exist inside a marriage, a loneliness more profound than any widowhood. Dignity was a luxury she could no longer afford, but she clung to its tattered remnants with a fierce, quiet desperation. She took in mending until her fingers were raw, the pay barely enough to cover her rent and a little flour. When that was not enough, she swallowed her pride, a hard, bitter lump in her throat, and sought work elsewhere. No respectable household in town would have her. The whispers followed her like a shadow, tainting her reputation beyond repair. It was Mr. Henderson, the owner of the mercantile, who finally offered a solution, though his eyes held more pity than respect. The Barrett Ranch, out past Red Creek, is looking for a cook, he had told her, not quite meeting her gaze. It is rough work, Mrs. Harland, lonely place, but they pay in cash and board. And so she had come to this place of red hills and scorched grasslands, a sprawling cattle operation that felt like the edge of the world. The Barrett Ranch was a world of men, dust, and unending labor. Her domain was a small, stiflingly hot cookhouse attached to her own tiny cabin, a cramped space that always smelled of bacon grease, old coffee, and lye soap. Her cabin was little more than a box with a cot, a small stove, and a single window that looked out onto the vast, indifferent landscape. The wind was worse here, a constant, whining pressure against the thin wooden walls. It never stopped blowing, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush, dry earth, and the distant, sharp smell of cattle. The ranch hands were a coarse, weather-beaten lot. Most were young men escaping something from back east, their faces already etched with the harsh lines of the frontier. They treated her with a grudging sort of indifference, so long as the coffee was hot and the biscuits were fresh. They called her the widow, or sometimes just woman. A few, like a burly man named Silas, tried to press their attentions on her with crude jokes and lingering looks that made her skin crawl. She learned to make her face a mask of polite neutrality, to keep her eyes downcast, her movements efficient and unobtrusive. She served their meals, washed their plates, and scrubbed their sweat-stained laundry in a large tub behind the cookhouse. She endured their casual vulgarity in silence, building a wall around herself brick by invisible brick. Each sunrise was a trial, each sunset a small, weary victory. One afternoon, late in the summer, a new rider appeared. He came not from the main road, but from the west, a lone figure materializing out of the shimmering heat haze. Clara was hanging laundry on the line, the clothespins stiff between her chapped fingers. When she saw him, he rode a lean, dust-colored horse and sat in the saddle with an easy, tired grace. He was not old, perhaps a few years younger than her own 30 years, but he had the stillness of a man who had seen too much. She watched from the corner of her eye as he dismounted and spoke to the foreman, a hard-faced man named Jedediah Stone. The men were mending a fence near the corral, and their usual banter quieted as they sized up the newcomer. Clara could not hear their words over the snap of the bedsheets in the wind, but she saw Stone nod. The man was hired. His name, she learned later as she served supper, was Eli McCrae. He took a spot at the end of the long trestle table, away from the others. He ate without speaking, his movements measured and deliberate. Clara noticed his hands first. They were strong and calloused like the others, but there was a quietness to them. When he looked up to thank her for the plate, his eyes met hers for only a moment. They were gray, the color of a stormy sky, and held a deep, settled weariness that she recognized. A thin, white scar cut through his left eyebrow. Another jagged line ran from the corner of his mouth down to his jaw, marks of a life lived hard. She had heard the men mention the war between the states. Perhaps that was where he had earned them. Eli McCrae did not join in the men's rough-and-tumble talk. When Silas made a particularly foul joke about widows and cold beds, a remark clearly aimed at her, Eli's gaze remained fixed on his plate. He did not laugh. He did not even smile. He simply finished his meal, nodded once in her direction, and left the cookhouse. His silence was more of a shield than a comfort, but in a place where noise was a constant assault, it was a small mercy. Clara found herself watching him in the days that followed. He was a good worker, methodical and tireless. He had a way with the horses, a gentle touch that calmed even the most skittish mare. He moved with a purpose that lacked the swagger of the other cowboys. There was a coiled quietness about him, a sense of a man holding himself in check. The nights were the hardest part of her existence on the Barrett Ranch. The cold seeped through the floorboards of her cabin, a damp chill that settled deep in her bones, from her window. She could see the warm, yellow light spilling from the bunkhouse. She could hear the men's boisterous laughter, the faint, tinny sound of a harmonica, the thud of thrown dice. Their world was loud and communal, a fortress of male companionship against the vast, empty darkness of the plains. Her own world was silent. The only sounds in her cabin were the creak of the floorboards, the sigh of the wind, and, on the worst nights, the soft, choked sound of her own weeping. She cried for the life she had lost, for the respect she could not reclaim, and for the suffocating loneliness that was now her only constant companion. In those dark, silent hours, the memories of Jacob would return, unbidden and sharp as broken glass. She did not miss him, and the guilt of that admission was a heavy stone in her heart. What she missed was the idea of what could have been, the dream of a shared life that had soured into a nightmare. She remembered his cruelty, the way his voice, thick with liquor, could turn from loving to monstrous in the space of a breath. She remembered the fear, a cold knot in her stomach whenever she heard him ride home late from the saloon. She remembered the loneliness she had so carefully hidden behind a polite smile for the whole town to see, the pretense of a happy wife. She had been more alone with him than she was now, she realized, and the thought offered no comfort, only a deeper shade of sorrow. A week after Eli McCrae's arrival, Clara was at the well, struggling with the heavy oak bucket. The morning's laundry had been a punishing task, and her hands were red and raw, the skin cracked and bleeding in places from the harsh lye soap. The rope cut into her palms as she hauled it up, hand over hand, her shoulders aching with the strain. "Let me give you a hand with that, ma'am." The voice was low and quiet, so close behind her that she started, dropping the rope a few inches with a splash. She turned to find Eli standing there, his hat in his hands. The morning sun lit the lines on his face, making him look older than his years. "I can manage," she said, her voice coming out sharper than she intended. It was a reflex, a defense against any offer of help, which too often came with an unspoken price. He did not argue or press the matter. He simply stood there, his gray eyes looking not at her face, but at her hands, still gripping the rope. He saw the raw skin, the faint smears of blood, A flicker of something. Pity. Understanding. She could not tell. Passed through his gaze. "No need to do it all yourself," he said. His voice still quiet. He reached out, not for her, but for the rope above her hands. For a long moment, she hesitated. Her pride screamed at her to refuse, to show him and everyone else that she needed nothing from any man. But her body ached, and the simple, unconditional kindness in his gesture was something she had not felt in years. It chipped away at the wall she had so carefully built. Slowly, she released her grip, her fingers uncurling from the coarse hemp. He took her place at the well's edge, and with a few easy pulls, he drew the heavy bucket up and set it on the wooden lip. He did not speak as he unhooked it and filled the 2 pails she had brought. When he was done, he turned back to her. "There you go, ma'am." "Thank you, Mr. McCrae," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. He just nodded, his eyes meeting hers again for a fraction of a second longer than was necessary. In that brief, silent exchange, something unspoken passed between them. She saw a flicker of his own deep-seated pain, a shared understanding of what it meant to be wounded and alone. He saw, perhaps, the shame and exhaustion she tried so hard to hide. It was a moment of dangerous, unexpected connection, a tiny spark of warmth in the cold expanse of her life. He put on his hat, gave a slight dip of his head, and walked away toward the barn, his stride even and unhurried. Clara stood by the well long after he had gone, her heart thumping a strange, unfamiliar rhythm against her ribs. She looked down at her pail, at her own wavering reflection in the still water. The kindness of a stranger had unsettled her more than all the crude jests of the other men. It had breached her defenses, leaving her feeling vulnerable and strangely exposed. And beneath the shame and the fear, a tiny, treacherous seed of longing began to stir. It did not take long for the others to notice. A quiet word, a shared glance. Such things were currency on a place like the Barrett Ranch. They were dissected and discussed in the bunkhouse at night, twisted into something ugly. "Looks like the new man's aiming to comfort the widow," she heard Silas say one evening as she cleared the supper dishes. His voice was loud enough for her to hear, and the snickers that followed were like stones thrown at her back. "He is just drawing water," another man chimed in. "Nothing wrong with that." "That is how it starts," Silas drawled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near the door. "A bucket of water, a kind word. Before you know it, he will be warming her bed for her." The laughter that followed was coarse and knowing. Clara felt a hot flush of humiliation creep up her neck. She kept her back to them, her hands moving mechanically, stacking the plates. Their words stung, not just because they were cruel, but because they cheapened the one small act of decency she had been shown. They reduced it to the basest of motives, confirming her status as a woman defined only by her presumed needs and her availability. She was not a person to them, not a woman grieving and struggling to survive. She was a prize to be won, or a vessel for their crude fantasies. The land itself seemed to conspire with her feelings of entrapment. It was a place of brutal contradictions. The sky was immense, a vast, endless blue that stretched from one horizon to the other, making her feel impossibly small and insignificant. But the land itself was suffocating. The sunburned plains rolled on forever, offering no place to hide. Dust storms would blow in without warning, turning the sky a dirty yellow and choking the air, forcing everyone indoors and magnifying the sense of confinement. At dusk, the coyotes would begin their mournful, yipping cries from the red hills, a sound of wild, desolate loneliness that resonated deep within her soul. The world felt too big and her life felt too small, and she was trapped somewhere in between. As summer bled into autumn, the air grew crisp, and the wind carried the first sharp bite of the coming winter. The days shortened, the light taking on a thin, golden quality. The threat of snow lay heavy on the horizon, a promise of even greater isolation. The ranch became a flurry of activity. the men working from sunup to sundown to bring in the last of the herd and prepare the buildings for the harsh months ahead. Clara worked just as hard, canning the last of the garden vegetables, mending winter clothes, and ensuring the larder was stocked. She and Eli McCrae continued their silent dance of avoidance and awareness. They rarely spoke beyond a polite greeting, but she felt his eyes on her sometimes as she worked. A steady, watchful presence. He left a pile of chopped firewood by her cabin door one evening, neatly stacked and ready for her stove. He asked for nothing in return, and when she thanked him the next morning, he merely nodded, a faint warmth in his gray eyes. One night, as the first flakes of snow began to drift down from a bruised-looking sky, Clara knelt by her cot. She did not often pray anymore. God had felt as distant and indifferent as the Wyoming sky for a long time. But tonight, a confusion of feelings churned inside her, feelings she could not control and did not understand. She thought of a quiet man with sad eyes and a gentle touch. She thought of the shame the other men's words brought her, and the strange, fluttering hope that his small kindnesses ignited. It felt like a betrayal of her mourning, a sin against a husband she had not even loved. She folded her raw hands, closed her eyes, and let the words come in a halting whisper, lost in the sound of the rising wind. She prayed for strength to endure the winter, for peace from the memories that haunted her. And then, her voice dropping even lower, she asked for forgiveness, not for anything she had done, but for the feelings she could not yet name, for the treacherous and hopeful stirring of a heart she had long thought was frozen solid. Outside, the snow fell faster, blanketing the harsh land in a layer of pure, unforgiving white. Winter did not arrive in Wyoming. It descended. It came down from the mountains like a predator, silent and swift, and seized the land in its icy grip. The wind, which had been a constant companion, sharpened into a razor, howling through the smallest cracks in the bunkhouse and Clara's small cabin. A ceaseless, mournful sound. The world shrank, its horizons drawn in by curtains of falling snow. The Barrett Ranch became an island in a vast, white sea, a self-contained universe of shivering horses, huddled men, and the biting scent of wood smoke. In this compressed, isolated world, Eli McCrae's character became clearer. He was not a man who spoke of his abilities. He demonstrated them. When a new gelding, a wild-eyed beast that had thrown two other men, was brought into the corral, Eli approached it not with force, but with a patient, unyielding calm. He spent hours just standing near it, speaking in a low murmur, until the horse's trembling ceased. When he finally mounted, it was with a fluid motion that seemed less a conquest and more an agreement. He was the first one out in the mornings, his lantern a lone pinprick of light in the pre-dawn gloom, and the last to finish his chores. He mended harnesses with a neat, practiced stitch and could set a fence post so firmly it seemed to have grown from the frozen earth. Even Jedediah Stone, the foreman, whose praise was as rare as a warm day in January, began to watch Eli with a grudging respect. He started assigning him the most difficult tasks, and Eli completed them without complaint or comment. This quiet competence did not go unnoticed by Clara. She saw it all from the periphery of her own relentless work. Their paths crossed a dozen times a day, small orbits in the constricted universe of the ranch. At mealtime, when she ladled stew onto his plate, their fingers would sometimes brush, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt through her. As she hung laundry, the stiff, frozen sheets snapping in the wind, she would see him in the distance, his figure stark against the snow, mending a section of fence. Sometimes he would look up, and their glances would meet across the frozen expanse. The looks grew longer, more hesitant, fraught with a silent questioning that neither of them dared to voice. It was a fragile, dangerous language spoken only with their eyes. One evening, after a particularly grueling day spent hauling cattle feed through thigh-deep drifts, Eli was the last one to enter the cookhouse. The other men had already eaten and retreated to the relative warmth of the bunkhouse. He moved stiffly. His shoulders slumped with fatigue, and a fine layer of frost clung to his eyelashes and the brim of his hat. He sat at the empty table, his head bowed for a moment, as if in prayer or exhaustion. Clara had a fresh pot of coffee simmering on the stove, its rich, dark aroma filling the small room. On impulse, an act of unthinking compassion, she poured a cup and carried it over to him. She set it on the table beside his plate. "You look like you could use this," she said, her voice softer than she had intended. He looked up, his gray eyes shadowed with weariness. A faint surprise registered on his face before he composed his features. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rasp. He wrapped his cold, chapped hands around the warm tin cup, as if drawing life from its heat. She busied herself at the stove, her back to him, her heart thumping. It was the first time they had been truly alone. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the incessant moan of the wind. "Losing my family back in Pennsylvania," he said suddenly, his voice quiet. "It makes a man used to the quiet." Clara froze, her hand still on the skillet. She turned slowly to face him. He was looking into his coffee cup, his expression unreadable. She did not know what to say, but the unexpected confession seemed to demand one of her own. "My husband's passing," she began, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. It took my place in the world. I became something else, someone else." She looked down at her own hands, scarred and reddened from work. A person can be lonely even when they are not alone. He looked up then, and his gaze was direct and full of a profound, startling understanding. He knew, he understood the loneliness that came not from solitude, but from being unseen, from being judged and defined by others. In that shared moment of vulnerability, the space between them seemed to shrink, charged with a new and potent intimacy. He said nothing more, but he did not have to. When he finished his coffee, he stood, and his "Thank you, Clara" was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it from his lips was both strange and deeply comforting. Their small, fragile connection did not escape the foreman's notice. A few days later, Jedediah Stone stopped her as she was carrying a load of firewood from the woodpile to her cabin. He was a tall, raw-boned man with eyes the color of faded denim, and they missed nothing. "Mrs. Harland," he said, his tone flat and businesslike. He blocked her path, forcing her to stop. "A word of advice. This is a ranch, not a social club. The men have their work, and you have yours." Clara's grip tightened on the rough bark of the firewood. "I am aware of that, Mr. Stone." "See that you are," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "It is not a good thing for a woman in your position to get too friendly. Men get ideas. It causes trouble. You are here to cook and clean. That is all. Do you understand me?" The words were a slap in the face. A woman in your position. The phrase branded her, reminded her of her station as a charity case, a disgraced widow living on the scraps of the world's tolerance. Humiliation burned in her cheeks. "I have done nothing to be ashamed of," she said, her voice tight. "I am not saying you have," he replied, his voice softening slightly, though the warning remained. "I am saying you should take care that you do not. McCrae is a good worker. I would not want to lose him over some foolishness." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving her standing in the snow, her arms aching from the weight of the wood, her heart aching with a fresh sense of shame. He had not been unkind, but his message was clear. She was a potential problem, a disruption to the order of his world. Any connection she might form was not a comfort, but a complication. The first big blizzard of the season hit that night. It descended with a furious, blinding wall of white, erasing the world. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and snow piled in monstrous drifts against the doors and windows. Work was impossible. The men were confined to the bunkhouse, and the small space quickly filled with the restless energy of trapped animals. The air grew thick with the smell of wet wool, stale tobacco, and cheap whiskey that someone had smuggled in. Clara's own woodpile was running low, and she knew she would need more to last through the night, bundling herself in every layer she owned. She fought her way through the storm to the main woodpile near the barn. The wind tore at her, stealing her breath and driving ice crystals into her face. She was struggling to load a few logs into her arms when the door to the cookhouse opened, and Eli emerged, pulling his coat collar up around his ears. Without a word, he came to her side and began to gather a much larger load of wood. "It is too heavy for you," he said, his words nearly snatched away by the wind. "I will carry it." Together, they struggled back toward her cabin, the blizzard raging around them. Just as they reached her door, a particularly violent gust of wind slammed into them. Clara stumbled, and Eli reached out to steady her. His hand closed over her arm, his grip firm and warm even through the layers of her coat and his glove. They stood there for a moment, braced against the storm, his hand a solid anchor in the chaos. "The bunkhouse is warmer," he shouted over the wind. "You should not stay in here alone." Before she could protest, he was pushing her door open and guiding her toward the attached cookhouse, which connected to the main bunkhouse. The sudden blast of heat and noise was a shock. The men were crowded inside, playing cards, talking loudly, their faces flushed. As Clara and Eli entered, a hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to them. Silas, his face slick with sweat and whiskey, grinned. "Well, look what the storm blew in. Careful, Eli, the widow's got a curse on her. Her last man ended up dead." A wave of crude laughter followed. Clara flinched as if struck. The heat in the room felt suffocating, the dozens of male eyes on her a physical violation. She wanted to run, to disappear, but she was frozen in place by humiliation. Eli's expression did not change. His face remained a calm, unreadable mask. He simply ignored the jibe, setting his load of firewood down by her stove. "You have enough to last the night now," he said to her, his voice low, meant for her ears alone. He turned and walked back into the main room, taking a seat on a crate in the corner, away from the others, and began to mend a piece of tack, his attention completely absorbed in his task. Clara fled to the relative privacy of her small cabin, the laughter still ringing in her ears. She sat on the edge of her cot, trembling, her body cold despite the warmth now radiating from her stove. She felt stripped bare. Her private grief and struggle turned into a source of public amusement. Later, when the noise from the bunkhouse had quieted to a low murmur, she heard voices just outside her wall. The wind had died down some, and the words carried with startling clarity. "You should not have said that about her husband," a younger cowboy, a boy named Billy, was saying. "It is just a joke," Silas slurred in response. "She is a widow, ain't she? She knew what she was getting into, coming to a place like this." "It is not a joke," another voice said. It was Eli's. His tone was not loud, but it had a hard, flat quality that cut through the night. "The woman works harder than any two of you. She has lost everything and asks for nothing. Her name is Clara. You will use it, and you will leave her in peace." There was a moment of stunned silence. Then Silas's belligerent reply. "And who are you to be telling me what to do, McCrae?" "I am telling you," Eli said, his voice dropping even lower, yet carrying a weight of deadly seriousness. "Leave her be." Clara pressed her ear against the cold wood of the wall, her breath held tight in her chest. She heard some more muttering, then the sound of boots crunching away in the snow. He had defended her. In this place where she was invisible, where her dignity was a thing to be trampled on for sport, he had stood up for her. He had spoken her name. That night, she wept. She lay curled on her cot, the rough wool blanket pulled up to her chin, and cried silently into her pillow. The tears were not just for the humiliation she had suffered, but for the unexpected, painful gratitude that flooded her heart. It was a terrible thing, she realized, to have forgotten what kindness felt like. It was a sharp, aching relief to know that someone still cared, and a deep, burning shame that it had come to this. The days that followed were quiet. The blizzard passed, leaving the world pristine and silent under a thick blanket of snow. The men were subdued, and Silas avoided her gaze completely. A new, unspoken tension hung in the air. A few days later, Clara was outside by the chicken coop, trying to fix the broken wooden latch on the small door. The cold had made the wood brittle, and the nail had torn through. Her fingers were numb, clumsy with the cold, and she fumbled with the hammer, dropping the nail into the snow for the third time. Frustration and helplessness pricked at the corners of her eyes. "Here, let me—" Eli was there, kneeling in the snow beside her before she had even registered his approach. He took the hammer from her unresisting fingers. His own hands were bare, and she could see the faint tracery of old scars across his knuckles. He found the nail she had dropped and, with a few precise, efficient taps, secured the broken piece of the latch back in place. He tested it once, twice, then looked at her. He was so close she could see the flecks of brown in his gray eyes, the way the cold had reddened the tips of his ears. She opened her mouth to thank him, but the words caught in her throat. Her gratitude felt too large, too complicated for a simple phrase. He seemed to understand. He looked at her, his expression softening. "No one deserves to live under cruel tongues, Clara," he said softly. "No one." His voice was a balm on the raw wound of her pride. He reached out and, for a fleeting moment, his fingers brushed against hers. His touch was warm and steady against her frozen skin. The contact was brief, but it sent a tremor through her entire body. She pulled her hand back as if burned, a fresh wave of confusion and fear washing over her. Just then, her eyes were drawn to the horizon. The sky to the west was changing. The pale winter blue was being consumed by a roiling mass of bruised, black clouds. A new storm was brewing, this one looking faster and more violent than the last. The wind began to pick up again, a low, ominous whistle that promised fury. Jedediah Stone's voice boomed from the corral. "McCrae, get a horse! There is a small herd still out in the western pasture. We need to get them in before this hits." Eli was on his feet in an instant, his brief moment of tenderness gone, replaced by the focused intensity of a working cowboy. He gave her one last, quick look, a look that held a silent apology, a warning, a promise. She could not tell which, and then he was running toward the barn. Clara stood by the chicken coop, a small, frozen figure in the vast landscape, and watched as he rode out. He galloped west, directly into the teeth of the approaching storm, his figure growing smaller and smaller until it was finally swallowed by the tempest. She waited. The storm hit the ranch with the force of a physical blow, a maelstrom of wind and driving snow. She retreated to the cookhouse, but she could not work. She stood by the window, peering out into the swirling whiteness, her hands twisting in her apron. Every shriek of the wind sounded like a cry of doom. She imagined him out there, lost, his horse falling, the cold seeping into his bones. The terror that gripped her was primal and fierce. It was more than concern for a fellow human being. It was a deep, personal dread that hollowed her out, leaving only a cold, sickening fear. An hour passed, then another. The other men had managed to get the rest of the stock into the barn and were now safely in the bunkhouse. Only Eli was still missing. Clara paced the small floor of the cookhouse, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was no longer the detached, stoic widow. She was a woman terrified for the safety of a man who had shown her kindness. Just when she had given up hope, when the darkness outside was nearly absolute, she saw a shape emerge from the blizzard. It was a horse, staggering with exhaustion, and a figure slumped low in the saddle. It was him. He was alive. Relief so powerful it made her weak in the knees washed over her. She grabbed the heaviest wool blanket she owned and threw open the door, rushing out into the storm. He slid from the saddle, his movements stiff and uncoordinated, and nearly collapsed. His face was a mask of ice, his clothes frozen solid. She ran to him, wrapping the thick blanket around his shivering shoulders. "Eli!" she cried, her voice choked with emotion. He looked at her, his eyes dazed, struggling to focus. His breath came in ragged, white plumes in the frigid air. Steam rose from his damp skin where the warm blanket met his frozen coat. Through that rising mist, their eyes locked. The world seemed to fall away. There was no storm, no ranch, no prying eyes. There was only the two of them, standing in the heart of the tempest. The air between them trembled, charged with everything they had not said, everything they had felt. It was a silence filled with her terror and relief, with his exhaustion and survival. It was dangerous. It was tender. And in that moment, Clara knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that something had irrevocably changed. The blizzard broke as violently as it had begun, leaving behind a world scoured and remade in white. But as the sun, a pale, watery disk, climbed into the sky, the true cost of the storm revealed itself. The thaw that followed turned the snow-covered ranch into a treacherous sea of mud and slush. The wind, though lessened in its fury, still carried a blade-sharp chill that cut through the thickest wool. The greatest damage was to the northern corral. A massive section of the fence had been torn down by the sheer force of the wind. The heavy posts snapped like twigs, leaving a gaping hole through which the cattle could wander onto the open, dangerous plains. There was no question of rest. Jedediah Stone had the men out at first light, their faces grim, their movements stiff with cold and exhaustion. The work was brutal. They waded through mud that sucked at their boots, their hands raw from handling the ice-crusted wood and frozen rope. The air was filled with the splintering crack of axes, the thud of mallets against new posts, and the low, strained curses of the men. It was a race against the coming night, against the possibility of losing the herd. Clara watched from the cookhouse window, her own work of providing hot coffee and a constant supply of food feeling small and inadequate in the face of their struggle. She saw Eli among them, moving with a tireless, focused energy. He did not waste motion or words, his strength directed entirely at the task. Each time he lifted a heavy post, his muscles straining against his damp shirt. She felt an answering tension in her own body, the memory of him returning from the storm, his face a mask of ice, his eyes locking with hers through the rising steam, was a constant, unsettling presence in her mind. She had wrapped him in a blanket, a simple act of care, but it had felt like so much more. It had felt like a claim. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, painting the muddy snow in shades of purple and gray, she knew the men would not stop. They would work into the night by lantern light. A hot meal was the least she could do. She spent the next hour preparing a thick, hearty beef stew, its savory aroma a small comfort against the encroaching cold. She packed it into a large, covered pot, along with a stack of fresh biscuits and a tin of coffee, and bundled herself against the wind. The journey from the cookhouse to the ruined corral was a short distance, but it felt like a mile. The wind had picked up again, a malevolent force that tore at her skirts and tried to rip the heavy pot from her hands. The ground was a slick, unpredictable mire of half-frozen mud. She picked her way carefully, her eyes on the flickering lanterns that now dotted the work area. She was only a few yards away when it happened. Her boots slid on a hidden patch of ice beneath the mud, and her feet went out from under her. She gave a small, startled cry as she fell, twisting to protect the stew. The pot flew from her hands, landing with a soft thud in a snowbank, but she landed hard on her side, the impact jarring through her bones. A sharp pain shot through her ankle. Before she could even process the fall, Strong hands were on her, gripping her arms. "Clara, are you hurt?" Eli's face was inches from hers, his features stark and worried in the flickering lantern light. He was covered in mud, his hair plastered to his forehead, but his gray eyes were clear and intensely focused on her. I think I am all right," she stammered, embarrassed and shaken. "The stew." "Never mind the stew," he said, his voice firm. He easily lifted her to her feet, but she cried out as she put weight on her ankle. His grip on her arms tightened, steadying her. He held her there for a moment, his hands warm and solid, a stark contrast to the biting cold. His touch was no longer the brief, accidental brush of fingers. It was a deliberate, supportive hold that lingered too long to be merely practical. It was a conscious connection. And in the space of that charged silence, she could feel the frantic beating of her own heart. He did not let go. It felt as if he could not. Suddenly, the world was split apart by a deafening crash of thunder. It was not the low rumble of a distant storm, but a violent, explosive crack that seemed to come from directly overhead. In the same instant, a bolt of lightning forked across the black sky, illuminating the entire scene in a ghostly, blue-white flash. In that split second of unnatural light, she saw the raw concern etched on Eli's face, a look of profound, unguarded emotion that stole her breath. Instinctively, reflexively, he pulled her against him. It was not a gentle drawing in, but a swift, protective motion, his body shielding hers from the unseen threat of the storm. Her face was pressed against the rough wool of his coat, which smelled of pine, wet earth, and the clean scent of the cold. His arm was wrapped securely around her waist. Holding her tightly, she could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart against her cheek, a rhythm of life in the midst of the storm's chaos. The world roared around them, but in the circle of his arms, there was a strange, terrifying stillness. He was an anchor, and she was adrift. "We need to get you inside," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. He did not loosen his grip. He began to guide her, half carrying her, toward the nearest shelter, the long, dark shape of the bunkhouse. The wind howled, and a sudden, torrential downpour began, the rain so cold it felt like needles against her skin. They stumbled through the mud, two figures clinging to each other against the fury of the elements. Eli kicked open the bunkhouse door and helped her over the threshold into the dim, stuffy warmth. The air inside was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, and cheap whiskey. Only a few men were present. Two were sprawled on their bunks, lost in a drunken slumber, their snores a heavy, rhythmic counterpoint to the storm. Silas sat at the far end of the room, slumped over a table, a half-empty bottle beside his hand. His head lolling, none of them stirred. For all intents and purposes, Clara and Eli were alone. Eli gently lowered her onto a wooden bench near the cold central stove. Just as he released her, a furious gust of wind caught the heavy door and slammed it shut with a tremendous boom that echoed through the room. The iron latch fell into place with a definitive, metallic click. They were trapped. The sound was like a key turning in a lock, sealing them inside, separating them from the world outside and from the lives they were supposed to be living. The only light came from a single lantern left burning on the table, its flame guttering and dancing, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. Outside, the rain began to pound on the tin roof, a relentless, deafening drumming that drowned out every other sound. It was an intimate, enclosing noise that made the small, dim space feel like the only room in the world. Eli knelt before her, his expression grim. "Let me see your ankle." His touch was surprisingly gentle as he carefully slid her boot off. Her ankle was already beginning to swell. He swore softly under his breath. He found a bucket of clean water and a rag and began to clean the mud from her skin with slow, methodical movements. Clara watched his hands, strong and scarred, moving with such tenderness. A shiver ran through her, one that had nothing to do with the cold. They sat in silence for a long time, the storm raging around them, the dim light, the isolation, the sheer, raw power of the weather outside, all conspired to strip away the usual barriers that stood between them. Here, in this crude shelter, they were not the widow and the hired hand. They were just a man and a woman, taking refuge from a storm. "The war?" he said, his voice so quiet she had to lean forward to hear him over the rain. "The thunder, it always sounds like cannon fire to me." He did not look at her as he spoke, his gaze fixed on the flickering lantern flame. "You never forget that sound, or the silence that comes after. The quiet is the worst part. After all that noise, the quiet feels empty, wrong, like the world has stopped breathing." He was giving her a piece of himself, a shard of the pain he carried so silently. She felt an overwhelming urge to offer him something in return, to meet his vulnerability with her own. "I still hear my husband's voice sometimes," she confessed, the words a painful whisper. "In my dreams. It is not his kind voice, the one he used when we were first married. It is the other one, the one he used when he was drinking." She hugged her arms around herself, a tremor running through her. "I dream that he is calling for me, and I cannot find him, and I am not sure if I am relieved or afraid." It was the first time she had admitted the truth of her marriage to anyone. She had buried the fear and the loneliness under a veneer of proper grief. But here, in the dark with this quiet man, the truth felt necessary. He finally looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not pity, but a deep, sorrowful recognition. He understood. He knew what it was to be haunted. The lantern flame flickered violently, and a draft snaked through the room. Clara shivered, the dampness of her clothes seeping into her bones. Without a word, Eli stood, took off his own dry coat, and draped it over her shoulders. It was heavy and smelled of him, a clean, masculine scent that was both comforting and disturbingly intimate. The warmth of his body still clung to the fabric. He sat down on the bench beside her, not touching, but so close that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. The space between them was electric, charged with unspoken want and a guilt so profound it was a physical ache in her chest. Every beat of the rain on the roof seemed to echo the frantic pounding of her heart. Each breath she took was filled with his scent. The closeness was unbearable, a sweet, agonizing torture. She turned her head to look at him. His face was in shadow, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the troubled darkness in his eyes. He was fighting a battle within himself. She could see it, the same battle that was raging inside of her. "We shouldn't be doing this," she whispered, the words a fragile protest against the overwhelming pull she felt toward him. But even as she spoke, her body betrayed her. She leaned closer, her gaze falling to his mouth. He flinched as if her words had struck him. He started to pull back, his sense of honor, of propriety, warring with a deeper, more elemental need. He was a man who lived by a strict, unspoken code, and she was a violation of it. She was a widow, a woman he was meant to protect, not to desire. But then, seeing the conflict in his face, the raw loneliness that mirrored her own, she did something impossibly bold. She reached out and laid her hand on his. Her touch was light, hesitant, but it was enough. It was the spark that ignited the tinder. A shudder went through him, a deep, convulsive tremor. His restraint, so carefully maintained for so long, finally broke, with a low groan that was equal parts despair and desire. He turned to her, and his hands came up to cup her face. His calloused thumbs traced the line of her jaw, his touch both rough and reverent. And then he kissed her. It was not a gentle, hesitant kiss. It was a kiss of desperation, of starvation. It was the kiss of two lonely souls who had found a fleeting anchor in a raging storm. It was filled with all the grief and hardship and unspoken longing that had defined their lives. The world outside raged, the wind moaning through the cracks in the walls like a mournful spirit. But inside the bunkhouse, the only storm that mattered was the one they had unleashed in each other. He laid her down on the rough wooden bench, his body covering hers, shielding her, claiming her, and she surrendered to a need that felt both deeply wrong and impossibly right. A flood of feeling that washed away everything but the raw, undeniable truth of their shared touch. In the aftermath, as the storm outside began to quiet, she trembled in his arms. It was not a shiver from the cold. It was the trembling of a soul that had been shaken to its very foundations, of a heart that had been broken open. Everything she had kept buried for years, her grief, her shame, her loneliness, her long dormant desire, had risen to the surface. She felt raw, exposed, and terrifyingly alive. He held her, stroking her hair, his breath warm against her temple. The frenzy had passed, leaving behind a fragile, aching tenderness. He gently pulled his coat more snugly around her bare shoulders. "I will never speak of this to anyone," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I swear it. Clara, your name is safe with me." She could not speak. She could only nod, a single, jerky motion. Tears welled in her eyes, silent and hot, glistening in the dying lantern light. They were tears of gratitude for his gentleness, of fear for what they had done, of sorrow for the impossibility of it all. Slowly, the rain softened to a drizzle, then stopped altogether. The wind died down, its mournful howl replaced by a profound, dripping quiet. The storm had passed, but the silence that settled over the bunkhouse in its wake was heavier, more charged, and infinitely more complicated than the silence that had come before. The morning after the storm was unnaturally quiet. The world was a mess of churned mud and broken branches, but the air was still, holding its breath. Inside Clara, a storm of a different kind continued to rage. Shame, hot and sharp, was a physical presence in her throat. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the rough wool of his coat, the desperate, claiming pressure of his kiss, the terrifying and undeniable feeling of being wanted. She rose before dawn, her body aching, and threw herself into her work with a frantic energy, as if she could scrub the memory from her skin, scour the sin from her soul. She saw him at breakfast. He came in with the other men, his face set like stone. There were new, dark shadows under his eyes, and a tension in his shoulders that had not been there before. When he came to the serving line, she kept her gaze fixed on the ladle in her hand, her movements stiff and mechanical. She slopped oatmeal onto his plate without looking up, without a word. She could feel his presence, a tangible heat that seemed to singe the air between them. Her hand trembled so violently she nearly dropped the spoon. She heard him murmur a quiet, "Thank you, ma'am," but she did not, could not, respond. This became their new, torturous routine. She avoided his path, turning her back when he approached, busying herself with some pointless chore. She became a creature of downcast eyes and hurried movements. But her heart was a traitor. It leaped into her throat whenever she heard the sound of his voice, low and steady, speaking to one of the other hands. It hammered against her ribs when she caught his scent on the wind, a mixture of horse, leather, and pine. He was a constant, aching presence, a ghost who haunted the edges of her vision. Eli, for his part, retreated even further into himself. He worked with a grim, punishing intensity, taking on the hardest, most grueling tasks as if seeking exhaustion as a release. He rarely spoke to anyone, and the quiet stillness that had once seemed peaceful now felt freighted with a heavy, brooding sorrow. The easy rhythm of the ranch was broken. A new, discordant note had been introduced, and the other men sensed it. They watched Clara with her flinching avoidance and Eli with his silent, furious labor, and they began to talk. The whispers started in the bunkhouse, breeding in the dark like mold. Silas, who had woken from his drunken stupor with a throbbing head and a vague, disjointed memory of the night, was the one who gave the rumor its shape. The lantern was burning in there half the night, he slurred to the others, rubbing his temples. Heard voices, too, sounded like her. The suggestion was a spark in dry tinder. It twisted the story of their shared shelter into something sordid. A light in the bunkhouse, the widow and the quiet cowboy trapped by the storm. It was an easy, ugly calculation. The men's glances toward Clara grew more speculative, their jokes coarser. The fragile wall of indifference she had hidden behind had crumbled, leaving her exposed to a new kind of contempt, one edged with a leering suspicion. The whispers inevitably found their way to Jedediah Stone. The foreman caught her one afternoon as she was carrying a bucket of scraps to the pigs. His face was a thundercloud, his eyes cold and hard. "Mrs. Harland," he began, his voice devoid of any warmth. "There is talk." Clara's heart seized. She stared at the ground, at the toe of her worn boot. "I do not listen to gossip, Mr. Stone." "Sometimes it is my job to listen," he shot back. "Silas says the lantern was lit in the bunkhouse the other night. He says he heard you in there with McCrae." His voice was harsh, an accusation. "I want to know what you were doing in my bunkhouse after the men were supposed to be asleep." The question hung in the air between them, thick and poisonous. Humiliation washed over her in a sickening wave. Her mind raced, searching for a lie that would sound like the truth. "I fell," she said, her voice a reedy, trembling thing. "In the mud. Mr. McCrae helped me inside, out of the storm. My ankle, I twisted it." "And the lantern?" he pressed, his gaze boring into her. "Why was it burning for so long?" We talked," she stammered, hating the weakness in her own voice. "Until the storm passed, that is all." He was silent for a long moment, his disbelief a palpable force. "You are a widow on my ranch, Mrs. Harland. Your reputation is tied to mine. See that you remember that?" He turned and walked away without another word, leaving her standing there, trembling, the bucket handle cutting into her fingers. Her denial had been a confession, her fear a testament to her guilt. That evening, Eli found her by the woodpile. The sun was setting, staining the snow-covered hills a deep, bruised rose. He approached her quietly, his steps making no sound in the soft snow. "He spoke to you," Eli stated. It was not a question. Clara nodded, refusing to meet his eyes. She focused on a knot in the wood of the chopping block. "He thinks," she started, but could not finish. "I will leave," Eli said, his voice low and flat. "I will ride out in the morning. I can tell him I have family down in Colorado. It will put an end to the talk. It will keep you safe." At his words, a cold panic unlike anything she had ever known gripped her. His leaving would not save her. It would condemn her. It would be a confession written across the entire territory for everyone to read. The quiet cowboy had his way with the lonely widow and then rode on. It would be the story they told about her for the rest of her life. "No," she whispered, the word torn from her. She finally looked at him, her eyes wide with desperation. "Please, you cannot go. If you leave now, it will only make it worse. It will prove them right. Please, Eli, stay." Her use of his name, her raw, unguarded plea, seemed to strike him like a physical blow. He looked at her, his face a mask of anguish. In his eyes, she saw his own trapped state, his desire to protect her warring with the reality that his very presence was a danger. He gave a single, sharp nod, a silent agreement to their shared damnation. He would stay. The days that followed were a new kind of torment. They were allies in a secret war, bound by a shared lie. Their stolen glances across the corral were no longer just filled with hesitant longing. They were now freighted with a desperate, shared fear. They were partners in a crime that had no name. One afternoon, she returned to her cabin from the well and saw something on the small, rickety porch. It was a small piece of wood, whittled into the shape of a horse. It was no bigger than her thumb, the lines rough but carved with a careful, patient hand. The tiny horse was captured mid-gallop, its head thrown back, a spirit of freedom and wildness in its simple form. There were no words, no note, but she knew. She knew it was from him. She snatched it up, her fingers closing around the smooth, cool wood, and hurried inside. She held it in her palm, this small, secret token of his thoughts, this beautiful, silent message. It was a dangerous, precious thing. She hid it in her sewing box, beneath a tangle of thread, a hidden treasure in the ruins of her life. A week later, a buggy arrived from Laramie, a fine, polished carriage that looked deeply out of place in the muddy ranch yard. In it was Eleanor Barrett, the wife of the ranch owner. She was a stern, formidable woman with iron-gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her face into a permanent state of disapproval. She came once a season to inspect the ledgers and assert her authority. She summoned Clara to the main house. Mrs. Barrett sat in a high-backed chair, a porcelain cup of tea steaming untouched beside her. She treated Clara with a cold, brittle civility that was more insulting than outright cruelty. She inquired about the stores, the quality of the flour, the mending of the linens. Then, her sharp, bird-like eyes settled on Clara. "It is a difficult life out here for a woman alone, is it not, Mrs. Harland?" she said, her voice thin and precise. "It requires a great deal of fortitude, a deep commitment to propriety. A woman's reputation is all she has to shield her from the harshness of the world." She took a delicate sip of her tea. "Especially a woman in your particular circumstances. Some are never content to mourn properly. They allow their grief to make them careless." Every word was a carefully aimed dart. The humiliation burned in Clara's throat, hot and acidic. She felt crushed, pinned under the immense weight of judgment, the judgment of class, of gender, of gossip. To this woman, she was not a person, she was a category, a problem to be managed. She was a careless widow, a fallen woman who could not even be trusted to grieve correctly. Clara stood there, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, and endured the lecture in silence. There was nothing she could say that would not condemn her further. She fled the main house as soon as she was dismissed, her composure shattering the moment the door closed behind her. She ran, not to her cabin, but toward the creek at the edge of the property, her lungs burning, tears of helpless rage blurring her vision. She collapsed onto the frozen bank, her sobs racking her body. She did not hear him approach, but suddenly he was there, standing a few feet away, his presence a quiet comfort in the vast, cold emptiness. He did not touch her, did not offer empty platitudes. He just waited until her sobs subsided into shuddering breaths. "She has no right," he said, his voice a low growl. He came and sat on a fallen log near her. "Her world is built on looking down on others. It is how she feels tall." He looked out at the sluggish, ice-choked creek. "You are the only one here who still looks for goodness. Clara, in this whole sorry place, you are the only one." His words were like a balm on a raw wound. He saw her, not the widow, not the cook, not the sinner, but her. He saw a goodness in her that she had long forgotten was there. She looked at him, her face stained with tears, and saw in his gray eyes a reflection of her own pain, her own desperate need for grace. He leaned in, and his lips met hers. This kiss was different from the first. It was not born of frantic desperation, but of a deep, aching tenderness. It was a kiss of comfort, of shared sorrow, of defiance against the cruel world that condemned them. It was fleeting, a brief, fragile moment of peace, but she was the one who pulled away, a small, choked gasp escaping her lips. "God is watching us, Eli," she whispered, her voice trembling. The guilt, ever present, rushed back in, cold and sharp. The sky was turning a brilliant, bloody red with the setting sun, and it felt like a righteous, accusing eye staring down at them. That night, she dreamed. She stood on a muddy hill overlooking a small cemetery. It was raining, a hard, relentless downpour. She watched as the rain turned the earth around her late husband's grave into a river of mud. The simple wooden cross at the head of the grave tilted, leaned, and then was washed away completely, tumbling end over end in the brown, churning water until it disappeared from sight. She woke with a start, her heart pounding, the sound of the phantom rain still roaring in her ears. Her old life, her identity as Jacob's widow, was being washed away, leaving her adrift in a dangerous, unknown current. The fragile peace, the secret alliance, could not last. A week later, the whispers and the tension finally erupted. It happened after supper. Most of the men had already filed out of the cookhouse. Eli was finishing his coffee, and Silas, who had been drinking steadily all evening, stood up and blocked his path to the door. "You have got a lot of nerve." "McCrae," Silas said, his voice a belligerent slur. "Come in here, thinking you can just take what ain't yours." Eli slowly placed his cup on the table. He did not look at Silas, but his body went still, coiled like a spring. "I do not know what you are talking about," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Oh, I think you do," Silas sneered, stepping closer, his beady eyes flicking over to where Clara stood frozen by the stove. "Some things on this ranch belong to the men who have been here. They ain't for some quiet, scar-faced drifter to just help himself to." The insult was clear. He was not talking about a horse or a saddle. He was talking about her. He was calling her property. Eli stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floorboards. He was shorter than Silas, but he seemed to grow in stature, his stillness radiating a palpable menace. "You will move aside," he said, his voice flat, "and you will stop talking." "Or what?" Silas taunted, puffing out his chest. "You going to protect your little widow? Does she cry for you in the dark?" That was all it took. Eli moved faster than Clara would have thought possible. He did not throw a wild, drunken punch. It was a precise, brutal movement. His fist connected with Silas's jaw with a sickening crack of bone on bone. Silas staggered backward, a look of shocked surprise on his face, a trickle of blood starting from the corner of his mouth. Then his surprise turned to rage, and he lunged. The two men crashed against the table, sending plates and cups scattering. It was a desperate, ugly fight, filled with grunts and curses. Clara screamed, a sound that was lost in the chaos. The few remaining ranch hands shouted, some in encouragement, some in alarm. Jedediah Stone burst through the door, his face a mask of fury. He grabbed both men by their collars and tore them apart, throwing them against opposite walls. Silas was bleeding freely from his mouth and nose. Eli had a deep gash over his eye, the same one that was already scarred, and blood was streaming down his face. He stood panting, his chest heaving, his gray eyes blazing with a cold fire Clara had never seen before. "That is enough," the foreman roared. He looked from Silas's battered face to Eli's bloody one. His decision was instant. "McCrae, you are done. I knew you were trouble the minute I laid eyes on you. Get your things. I want you off this ranch by sunrise." The words struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. It was happening. They were casting him out because of her. He would be gone, and she would be left here alone to face the whispers and the contempt, her shame now cemented for all to see. In that moment, something inside her broke. The fear, the shame, the years of silent endurance. It all fell away, replaced by a single, burning conviction. "No," she said. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to her. The cook, the widow, the silent, unobtrusive woman had spoken. She took a step forward, her chin held high, her hands clenched at her sides. She looked directly at the foreman. "It was not his fault," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing with an authority no one had ever heard from her before. "Silas has been tormenting him for weeks. He has been tormenting me. He provoked this fight. Eli McCrae has been nothing but a gentleman. He has done nothing wrong. A collective gasp went through the room. Her public defense was an earthquake, shattering the unspoken rules of the ranch. Jedediah Stone stared at her, his mouth slightly agape, his face a mixture of shock and dawning, grim understanding. In his eyes, her defense was the final, irrefutable proof of their illicit affair. She had chosen a side. She had made her stand. The foreman's face hardened, his eyes turning to chips of ice. He looked from Clara's defiant face to Eli's bloody one and made his judgment. "I see," he said, his voice dangerously soft. He turned his cold gaze back to Clara. "In that case, Mrs. Harland, you can pack your things as well." The cost of her words, of her love, was absolute. "I want you both off the Barrett Ranch by dawn." The dawn that followed was the color of ash. A low, bruised gray sky pressed down on the Barrett Ranch, seeming to suck the very air from the world. Clara left as the first weak light touched the muddy, rutted yard. She carried a single dull, scuffed leather trunk that held everything she owned in the world. Jedediah Stone had given her the small amount of wages she was owed, his face a mask of cold duty, his eyes refusing to meet hers. He did not ask where she would go. No one did. She did not look for Eli. The shame was a physical thing, a heavy, suffocating blanket wrapped around her. To see him now, to face the man for whom she had sacrificed the last shred of her meager security, was more than she could bear. She assumed he was already gone, a lone rider disappearing back into the vastness from which he had come. She had stood up for him, and in doing so, had ruined them both. The thought was a bitter stone in her gut. A young hand, the boy named Billy, drove her into Laramie in a rickety buckboard. He did not speak for the entire journey, his silence a mixture of pity and fear, as if her disgrace were a contagion he might catch. She sat stiffly on the hard wooden seat, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her trunk resting at her feet. She was not just leaving the ranch. She was leaving behind a life, however meager it had been. She was carrying her shame back to the very town that had first branded her with it. Laramie was no kinder the second time around. The story of her dismissal from the Barrett Ranch seemed to travel faster than the buckboard that carried her. It was a juicier, more satisfying story than the one of her husband's death. This one had a clear villain and a clear fallen woman. By the time she secured a room, a small, airless space above the general store, with a window that looked out onto the dusty, bustling Main Street, the whispers had already begun to follow her. Her room was a cage. The sounds of the town filtered up through the floorboards, the rumble of wagon wheels, the shouts of men, the high-pitched laughter of women she had once known. It was a constant, mocking reminder of the world from which she was now utterly excluded. She bought a few meager supplies and an old sewing machine on credit from Mr. Henderson, the store owner, his eyes full of a sad, knowing pity. She began to work as a seamstress, taking in mending and alterations, her fingers that had grown rough and chapped from ranch work now relearning a more delicate, tedious labor. The days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of sewing, solitude, and shame. She rose with the sun, worked until her eyes burned from the flickering lamplight, and slept a thin, restless sleep haunted by dreams of storms and accusing eyes. Eli sent no word. As the first week turned into the second, and then the third, a cold, hard certainty settled in her heart. He had moved on. Of course he had. He was a drifter, a man with no ties, wounded by a past he never spoke of. Why would he tether himself to a ruined woman, to a scandal in a dusty Wyoming town? Her defense of him had been a fool's gesture, a moment of reckless defiance that had cost her everything and gained him nothing but the freedom to ride away. She tried to harden her heart against the memory of him, to convince herself that what had happened between them in the bunkhouse was nothing more than a shared moment of weakness, a brief fever in the midst of a storm. The townspeople made her penance a public spectacle when she ventured out for thread or flour. The gossip would quiet as she passed, only to resume in hushed, venomous tones the moment she was out of earshot. Women who had once offered polite nods now crossed the street to avoid her, gathering their skirts as if she were covered in filth. The preacher's wife, a woman whose face was a permanent mask of sour piety, looked straight through her one afternoon as if she were a ghost. The loneliness was a physical ache, a constant, hollow pressure in her chest. She had been lonely at the ranch, but this was a deeper, more profound isolation. This was the loneliness of the outcast, the pariah. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The last of the snow melted from the high country, and the relentless wind began to carry the scent of damp earth and new life. Spring was arriving in Wyoming, a slow, grudging season of pale green shoots pushing up through the hard ground. A fragile kind of peace began to settle over Clara. The sharp edges of her shame began to dull. Worn down by the relentless rhythm of her solitary life, she began to accept her fate. She would be the town seamstress, the disgraced widow, a woman whose story was a cautionary tale whispered over tea. She would survive. She would endure. She learned to live within the 4 walls of her small room, to find a strange, sterile comfort in the silence. The world could not hurt her if she did not let it in. Then, one afternoon, as she sat hunched over her sewing machine, mending a farmer's canvas coat, she heard a commotion in the street below. It was not unusual, but this had a different quality. A sudden hush, then a low murmur of voices. Curiosity, a feeling she had not felt in months, stirred within her. She rose and went to the window, pushing aside the thin curtain, and then she saw him. He was riding a different horse, a sturdy bay, but there was no mistaking the set of his shoulders. The quiet way he sat in the saddle, it was Eli McCrae. He looked thinner, harder. A fresh, dark bruise colored the side of his jaw, and a small, healing cut was visible on his cheekbone. He was bruised, but he was alive. He dismounted in front of the general store, his movements weary but deliberate, and tied his horse to the hitching post. He paused for a moment, his gaze sweeping the street, and then he looked up, straight at her window. Their eyes met. The world seemed to stop. The noise of the street faded to a distant hum. Everything she had tried to bury, the memory of his touch, the sound of his voice, the desperate, aching hope she had harbored and then killed, came rushing back in a tidal wave of emotion. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, trapped bird. She saw him take a deep breath, and then he disappeared from her sight. Entering the store below, she stood frozen by the window, her mind reeling. He was here. He had not forgotten. He had come back. A few moments later, she heard heavy, familiar footsteps on the wooden stairs outside her door. Then, a soft, hesitant knock. She opened the door to find him standing there, his hat in his hands. He looked tired, worn down to the bone, but his gray eyes were fixed on her with a raw, desperate intensity. The cramped hallway seemed to shrink around them, the air thick with everything they had not said, everything that had happened. The reunion was not a rush of emotion, but a collision of 2 awkward, wounded souls. The silence between them was a chasm filled with memory and regret. "Clara," he said, his voice a low, rough thing. "Eli," she managed to whisper. She stepped back, allowing him to enter the small room. He seemed too big for the space, his presence overwhelming the small, ordered world she had built for herself. He looked around, at the neat piles of mended clothes, the sewing machine by the window, the narrow cot in the corner. His gaze took in the poverty, the confinement of her existence. A muscle tightened in his bruised jaw. "I am sorry," he said, the words sounding inadequate, hollow. "For what happened? For all of this?" "It was not your fault," she said, her voice stronger now. "It was mine. I spoke when I should have stayed silent." "No," he said, shaking his head. "You spoke the truth. I never thanked you for that." He took a step closer, and she could see the exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes. I had to find work. It took me a while. I went south, near the Colorado line. I worked breaking horses, saved every dollar. He paused, gathering himself, as if the next words were heavy and difficult to lift. I bought a small piece of land. It is not much, just a patch of ground out by Sycamore Creek. Enough for a small cabin, a few head of cattle. The soil is good. Clara stared at him, her heart beginning a slow, painful thud. She did not understand. Why was he telling her this? He saw the confusion on her face. He took another step, closing the distance between them until he was so near she could feel the warmth of his body. "I am building a cabin," he said, his voice dropping, becoming more urgent. "And I came back to ask if you would come with me." The world tilted on its axis. The air rushed from her lungs. This was not what she had expected. She had braced herself for an apology, a final goodbye. Not this. "Come with you?" she repeated, the words sounding foolish in her own ears. "Not because you have nowhere else to go," he said quickly, his eyes pleading with her to understand. "Not as some kind of payment for what you did, not as shame, but as choice. Your choice." He reached out, his hand hovering in the air for a moment before he let it fall back to his side. "I want to build a life there. Clara, I do not want to build it alone." The hope that flared in her chest was so bright, so fierce. It was painful, but years of caution, of disappointment and public scorn, had built walls that were not so easily torn down. The world was still out there, just beyond her window. "Love does not erase the world's cruelty. Eli," she said, the words a bitter truth she had learned over and over. "They will still talk. They will still judge. They will follow us with their whispers wherever we go. We would be living in scandal. We would never have peace." He listened, his expression somber, and when she was finished, he nodded slowly. "Maybe not," he replied, his voice soft but filled with a conviction that seemed to shake the very foundations of her fear. "Maybe we will never be free of it, but it gives it meaning. Being alone, that is just surviving. Being together, facing it together, that is living. Their cruelty does not have to be the thing that defines us." His words struck at the very heart of her lonely existence. He was not offering an escape. He was offering a reason. He was offering a shared life, a partnership against the very world that had cast them both out. That night, she bought bread, cheese, and a small piece of salted pork from the store downstairs. They shared the simple supper in her small room, sitting on opposite sides of a tiny table. The silence was no longer awkward, but filled with a fragile, contemplative weight. As the last of the light faded from the sky, she lit a single lamp, its warm glow pushing back the shadows. As she reached for the water pitcher, her hand brushed against his. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a shockwave through her. She pulled her hand back, but not before she felt the familiar calluses, the warmth of his skin, the memory of the bunkhouse, of his hands on her face, in her hair, was suddenly, overwhelmingly present. And then, as if summoned by the memory, it began to rain. It started as a soft patter on the roof, then grew steadier, a rhythmic, insistent drumming that was achingly familiar. It was the same sound that had first bound them together, the sound of the storm that had stripped away their defenses and exposed the raw, lonely truth of their hearts. The sound broke her. A single tear tracked its way down her cheek. Then another. She tried to hide her face, to stifle the sob that rose in her throat. But it was no use. She began to weep softly, her shoulders shaking with the force of her pent-up emotions. She was torn between the terrifying, beautiful hope he offered and the deep, ingrained fear of more pain, more shame. To go with him was to step off a cliff, to trust that love could be a foundation strong enough to build a life upon. To stay was to remain in her safe, silent prison forever. Eli did not move. He simply sat and watched her, his own eyes glistening in the lamplight, giving her the space and the dignity to feel her own heart break and, perhaps, begin to heal. She cried until she had no tears left, until she was empty and still. In the quiet that followed, with the rain still drumming softly on the roof, she found her answer. In the morning, the rain had stopped, the air was washed clean, and the sun shone with a tentative, watery light. Clara packed her small trunk for the second time. She left the sewing machine, the spools of thread, the half-mended clothes. She was leaving that life, and the woman who had lived it, behind. When Eli came for her, she was waiting by the door. She did not need to speak. He saw the answer in her eyes. They rode out of Laramie together, side by side. She did not look back. The whispers and the judgmental stares of the townspeople seemed to shrink and fade behind them. Ahead of them, the plains rolled out, vast and green and filled with the promise of a new season. Together, under the wide, forgiving sky, they began to build something small and fragile in the wilderness. It was a life that might not last, a peace that might be shattered, a hope that could be extinguished by the first hard winter. But it was theirs, and for the first time in a very long time, it was enough. The cabin they built was small, made of cottonwood logs Eli had felled and stripped himself, chinked with a mixture of mud and dried grass they had prepared together. It stood in a shallow basin near Sycamore Creek, a lone, stubborn testament to human will in the vast, open fields of Wyoming. Months had passed since they had ridden out of Laramie, and in that time, a life had begun to take root in the unforgiving soil. Their existence was pared down to its essentials: the sun, the earth, the wind, and the relentless work of survival. Life was hard, a constant struggle against a land that gave nothing easily. But it was an honest life, and it was theirs. They fell into a rhythm dictated by the seasons and the needs of their small herd of cattle. Eli would rise before the sun, his movements quiet so as not to wake her, and head out to check the fences and the livestock. Clara would follow soon after, rekindling the fire in the hearth. Its warm, smoky scent the first greeting of the day. They shared the chores without discussion, moving in a comfortable, practiced dance. He dug a deeper well when the creek ran low. She planted a small garden of hardy vegetables that clung to life with a tenacity that mirrored her own. He mended the harnesses and shod the horses. She cooked their meals, mended their clothes, and turned their small cabin into a home. In the evenings, after a simple supper, they would sit on the porch they had built, a narrow plank of wood that faced west. They would watch the sun bleed across the enormous sky, setting the clouds on fire with impossible shades of orange and rose. Sometimes they talked, their conversations quiet and meandering, touching on the day's work or a hawk they had seen circling overhead. More often, they sat in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the gentle murmur of the creek. On clear nights, the stars were a brilliant, scattered dust of diamonds against black velvet, so close it felt as if she could reach up and touch them. In those quiet moments, pressed against his side, the warmth of his body a solid, reassuring presence. Clara felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost painful. It was a peace she had never known, a quiet joy that was as fragile and as beautiful as a wild prairie flower. They shared laughter, two small, unexpected bursts of it over a clumsy mishap or a shared memory, a sound that felt like a miracle in the great, solemn quiet of the plains. But the world did not forget them entirely. The land was vast, but word traveled on the wind. Occasionally, riders would pass in the distance, following the creek as a landmark. Sometimes they would stop for water, their eyes lingering on Clara with a flicker of recognition. She would see them exchange a look, a silent communication that spoke volumes. The story of the widow from the Barrett Ranch was a piece of local lore now, a bit of fireside gossip. In those moments, the old shame would rise in her, a cold, familiar ghost. She would feel their eyes on her back, feel the weight of their judgment, and for a moment, she would be back in Laramie. the pariah crossing a dusty street, but then Eli would come and stand beside her, his presence a silent declaration. Or she would look at the cabin they had built with their own hands, and the feeling would recede. The opinions of strangers were like distant thunder. She could hear the rumble, but the storm was no longer directly overhead. That first summer was a trial by fire. A drought settled over the land, turning the lush green grasses a brittle, dusty brown. The creek shrank to a muddy trickle, and the sun beat down with a merciless, white-hot intensity. The cattle grew thin, their ribs showing through their hides as they wandered listlessly in search of forage. Every day was a battle. Eli spent weeks reinforcing and extending their fences, working until his skin was burned the color of dark leather and his hands were a mass of blisters and cuts. Clara hauled buckets of water from the deepening well, her shoulders and back screaming in protest, to keep her small garden from withering into dust. They worked side by side, two small figures against a vast, indifferent landscape, their shared struggle a bond stronger than any spoken vow. They lost 2 calves to the heat, a blow that felt personal and cruel. That night, she found Eli by the corral, staring at the small, still forms, his face a mask of grim defeat. She came and stood beside him, sliding her hand into his. He squeezed it tightly, his grip a silent acknowledgement of their shared loss, their shared resolve. In their grief, they found a new kind of strength, a fierce, protective partnership against the harshness of the world. Just as the drought finally broke, a new terror arrived. It came quietly, a sickness that moved through their small herd like a phantom. It started with one of the older cows, a lethargy that turned into a hacking cough, then a fever that left the animal shivering and weak. Within a week, 3 more were sick. Panic, cold and sharp, settled in Clara's heart. The cattle were everything. They were their future, the foundation of the fragile life they were trying to build. Eli examined the animals, his face etched with a deep, helpless worry. "It is lung fever," he said, his voice low and grim. "I have seen it before. If we do not get medicine, we will lose them all." "Medicine?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "Where?" "There is a veterinarian in Cheyenne. He sometimes has a serum," he said. "It is a long ride. 3 days, maybe 4, if I push hard." Cheyenne. It was over 100 miles away, a punishing journey across rough country. To leave now meant riding into the unknown, with no guarantee of success. But to stay meant watching everything they had worked for die. There was no choice. He left the next morning before dawn. Clara stood at the cabin door, a small, still figure in the gray light, and watched him ride away. He turned once in the saddle, his face a pale oval in the gloom, and raised a hand. She raised hers in return, and then he was gone, swallowed by the immense, empty plains. The days that followed were the longest of her life. The silence of the homestead, once a comfort, became a source of terror. Every gust of wind sounded like a mournful cry. She did her chores mechanically, tending to the sick animals, forcing water down their throats, trying to tempt them with hay. At night, she sat by the fire, her sewing lying untouched in her lap, and prayed. She prayed for the cattle, but mostly, she prayed for him. She pictured him on the trail, his horse stumbling, a sudden storm, an encounter with desperate men. The fear she felt was a living thing, a cold, heavy presence that settled in her chest and never left. During that long, terrifying vigil, a profound realization dawned on her. She thought of the women in Laramie, of Jedediah Stone, of Eleanor Barrett. She thought of their whispers, their cold glances, their cruel judgments. And she realized, with a clarity that was both startling and liberating, that she did not care. Their opinions were nothing. The shame she had carried for so long was a phantom, a ghost with no power over her. What was the scorn of a town compared to the fear of a world without Eli in it? What was a ruined reputation compared to the thought of his horse returning riderless? The world had shrunk to the size of one man, and the only judgment that mattered was whether he would come back to her. The fear of losing him had burned away the last vestiges of her fear of what others thought. On the evening of the 8th day, she had nearly given up hope. He was 2 days late. She stood on the porch, staring out at the darkening landscape, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. And then she saw it, a speck on the horizon, a slow-moving shape. Her heart leapt into her throat. She ran out into the field, heedless of the rough ground, her eyes straining. It was him. It was his horse, staggering with exhaustion, and a figure slumped low in the saddle. He did not ride to the cabin. He rode until he was a few dozen yards away, and then he simply slid from the horse's back and collapsed in a heap on the ground. She reached him, her breath coming in ragged sobs. He was barely conscious, his face pale and drawn, his lips cracked and blue, his clothes were torn, and he was burning with fever. A small, precious bottle of serum was clutched in his hand. He had made it. He had come back. Somehow, she found the strength to drag him back to the cabin. She pulled him onto their bed, a dead weight of exhaustion and fever. For the next 3 days, she did not sleep. She was his anchor to the world, a fierce, determined guardian against the darkness that threatened to claim him. She bathed his face with cool water, spooned broth between his cracked lips, and held his hand through the long, fevered nights when he thrashed and called out names she did not know from a past he would not share. She nursed him with a desperate, focused love, her own exhaustion a distant, unimportant thing. In those dark, quiet hours, watching the shallow rise and fall of his chest, she knew she was no longer the frightened widow from Laramie. She was a woman fighting for the life of her husband in all but name, and she had never felt stronger. He woke on the 4th day, his fever broken. His eyes were clear, and when he saw her sitting by his bed, a weak smile touched his lips. "Clara," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. She began to cry then, silent tears of overwhelming relief that washed away the last of her fear. A month later, when Eli was back on his feet and the cattle, thanks to the serum, were slowly recovering, a rider came. He was a hand from the Barrett Ranch, and he carried a letter. Clara took it with a sense of dread, but the letter was not addressed to Eli. It was addressed to her. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. The handwriting was a rough, masculine scrawl. It said, "Mrs. Harland, I am writing to say that I was wrong. Silas, after he was let go, got drunk in Laramie and boasted of the lies he told about you and McCrae. He admitted he started the trouble. The new cook is lazy and the bunkhouse is a mess. I was wrong in my judgment of you. I hope you have found some peace. Sincerely, Jedediah Stone." She read the letter twice, then a third time, the simple, gruff words blurring through her tears. It was an apology, an admission. It was the world she had left behind acknowledging its mistake. The tears were not for the validation, for she no longer needed it. They were for the woman who had been so wounded by that judgment, a quiet farewell to the pain she had carried for so long. She showed the letter to Eli, and he read it, then wrapped his arms around her and held her as she cried. The following Sunday, they rode to the small, wind-swept cemetery outside Laramie. They did not go into the town itself, skirting it to the north. Jacob's grave was untended, the grass growing wild, the simple wooden cross leaning to one side. Clara knelt and cleared away the weeds with her own hands. She had brought a single white prairie flower, and she laid it on the packed earth. She stayed there for a long time, the wind whipping strands of hair across her face. Eli stood a respectful distance away by the horses, giving her this moment. She was not sure what she felt, not anger, not even sadness anymore. There was only a great, quiet emptiness, the feeling of a chapter finally, truly, being over. "Goodbye, Jacob," she whispered to the wind. "May you find peace." And then she stood up, brushed the dirt from her skirt, and walked away without looking back. That night, as they lay together in the darkness of their cabin, the familiar sound of the wind moaning across the plains outside, she felt a final, profound sense of release. The roof above them was one they had raised with their own hands. The bed they lay in was one he had built. This life was theirs, forged in hardship and defiance. She turned to him, her head resting on his chest, and felt the slow, steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. "Eli?" she whispered into the darkness. I think I finally feel forgiven." He was silent for a moment, and then he kissed her forehead, his touch gentle and sure. "We made it through the storm," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Outside, the wind still blew across the vast, empty plains of Wyoming. It was the same wind that had once sounded like the voice of her own desolation, the same wind that had raged and shrieked and torn their world apart. But tonight, filtered through the sturdy logs of the home they had built, cushioned by the love that filled the small, warm space, it sounded almost gentle, like a lullaby. As the first pale light of dawn began to touch the horizon, their cabin glowed with a soft, steady light, a fragile peace carved out of pain, a defiant love that had finally broken the silence of judgment. Thank you for listening to this story of love and survival in the Old West. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.